We have a limited time. The staff has said that we've got a half hour here, and we've got a special treat for the second half hour, which is related to the governor's climate change task force, and I'll explain that when we get started. We're glad to see you all here this morning. I think this will be a limited time. Getting an echo. Staff has said that we've got a half hour here, and we've got a special treat for the second half hour, which is related to the governor's climate change task force, and I'll explain that when we get started. We're glad to see you all here this morning. I think this will be a limited time. Getting an echo. Staff has said that we've got a half hour here, and we've got a special treat for the second half hour, which is related to the governor's. Now I've got to unmute. Good. Many of you have noted that we have a new generation of African-American political leaders in our community nowadays at both the city, county, and the state level. My favorites is Mandela Barnes, who was elected lieutenant governor a couple of years ago, and I'm glad to say we at First Unitarian Society helped him on his way when we had a Lieutenant Governor's Forum before the election. So I think we had a little bit of a part in helping him. And I'm going to be doing a series of forums to meet our American political leaders in the coming months. We'll have to see, but we're kicking off this series with Mandela Barnes, who is our current lieutenant governor. He's a product of Milwaukee Public Schools, was an organizer for MICA, which our church is connected with still, and has been busy for a couple of years. So we'll let him have make some comments, and then we'll have questions and answers and go from there. So welcome, Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes.
Well, thanks so much, Bruce. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for getting this set up. It is really good to see you again. Always enjoy having a chance to bump into you in person when we were able to do that safely, and just appreciate conversations that we've had about climate change amongst other issues. But I am so excited to be joining you for today's Sunday Forum. It's great to be back into the community, and I remember my days at MICA like it was yesterday, and having a chance to partner with the congregation on a number of issues. So again, I'm Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes, and I'm here to talk a little bit about some of the work that our administration is doing, especially in terms of equity and sustainability. And when I gave my inauguration speech, I spoke about equity and sustainability because I wanted those to be the two guiding principles, at least of my office, if not the entire administration. And I think that we are doing a solid job at making sure that we incorporate those two principles into all of our work. And when I ran for lieutenant governor, Bruce mentioned the forum that was held at the congregation, and it was about opportunity, knowing the differences between myself and so many other people who are around me, whether it was those in my neighborhood, those I went to school with, or sometimes even those that I'm related to. And I developed a deep understanding about the need to have opportunity be a part of every child's life. And unfortunately, that's not the case right now. And at the state level, we have a responsibility, whether it's funding our schools, whether it's making sure that children have clean water to drink, clean air to breathe, dismantling systems of racism, addressing public safety, and so many other issues. Our responsibility could not be more apparent now than it's ever been, especially as so many families, so many communities need a buffer from the harms that have been done at the federal level. and recognizing that our local government needs support. So we are wedged in between, and we are taking on the challenges. We're taking on the tasks. And I'm not going to sit here and say it's easy, but it does become that much less difficult when we have good partners in doing that work. And some of that is related to the Climate Change Task Force, and I will get to that in a little bit. But personally, for those who may not know my background, I was born and raised in Milwaukee. My mother, retired public school teacher, my father, retired factory worker, both very active in their respective unions. I grew up, was born on 26 and Locust, which is heart of the 53206 zip code. And don't have to tell this crowd too much about that zip code. People know the challenges. I graduated from John Marshall High School, went on to Alabama A&M University. And then after college, I worked on a campaign. That's how I got my start as a field organizer in 2008. And I came back to Milwaukee in 2009 after I finished college, after I worked, and ended up in Mayor Barrett's office, where I worked as an intern for a little bit. And then eventually I reached the level of receptionist in that office. And that was one of the most pivotal positions for me, having a chance to engage so many people in the public. And that is where I think I sort of realized that I had some desire to seek public office at some point in my life. But long story short, went to MICA after mayor's office, and then I ran for state rep in 2012. And I think about going to, running for office and all that it took. And I think about the support that I had from my family, my parents, my friends, even some of my old teachers, and so many other folks. And I thought about that in comparison to just life in general and the chances that certain people have and others don't. Everybody doesn't have those solid support systems. So it's up to us to fill the void, especially as people of faith. This is the work that we were called to do. We can't leave people just on the side of the road. We have to be that good Samaritan. We have to step in when it is necessary for us to lead. When we see people who are in trouble, people who are in danger, people who are constantly just in harm's way. And there are far too many people like that in our society, in our community. And one, yes, is the role of government to fill that void. But there has been such an absence for far too long. And the situation has gotten so bad. And that's why we need help to make a difference. And again, we can go back to the equity and sustainability part, because the biggest challenge that we are all facing, and we look at different challenges and say, well, one doesn't trump the other. We don't put one crisis before the other. However, climate change is that overarching issue. And I think that there is priority in combating climate change because there are so many other issues that are impacted, whether it's inequities amongst racial lines and class lines, whether it's the economic impact or even the health impact. It consumes everything. And so understanding that we need to work on issues of sustainability also strengthens my resolve to work on equity issues, because for far too long, we've had so many conversations about environmentalism, about sustainability, but that equity component hasn't been there. And you see these days with a number of organizations, and I use the Sierra Club as an example, because they were very intentional about looking at their past and the problematic aspects of it, and having that desire to move forward and do things differently in a way that is much more inclusive, in a way that is much more equitable for all communities. And I think that so many systems, even those that have been designed for good, have unfortunately left out marginalized communities. And that is something we have to be much better at as a society and as a movement, and as a movement for human life. And I say a movement for human life because people are literally losing their lives when folks decide to deny science, whether it's pretending that a pandemic is not ravaging people by the thousands. Like, we haven't lost almost 250,000 people in America, over 1,500 here in Wisconsin. And there was a recent report that said almost all of the lives that have been lost, as far as on the younger end of the spectrum, almost all of the younger lives that have been lost to COVID-19 have been Black and brown. And when that is the case, it is not a surprise when we have people in the highest offices saying that COVID-19 isn't necessarily a death sentence. And it's easy for them to say that because they have never cared about the people whose lives are being lost to this pandemic. And they're very blatant and open about their disregard for communities that are not theirs. But that is the bad side of things. And we are not in that space. We don't operate in that space. We operate to combat that space. And we still have work, even within our own movement, to do. We still have work that we need to do within our own movement to make sure that we are not doing even more harm or unintended harm to communities. So that is why it was important for me to attach the equity component to sustainability, because we can't have one without the other, nor should we want one without the other. And that work for me professionally probably started with Mike. I remember one of the first projects we were a part of was the Cleaner Valley Coalition. And that was to challenge and take We Energies to court because they're coal burning power plants. And that was one in a series of coal burning power plants all across this country that put pollution into the air that disproportionately falls down into and impacts communities of color, Black and brown communities specifically. And you see these higher rates of respiratory illnesses that impact children at a young age and prevents them from being able to live the productive lives that they should be able to. And in doing some of this work, that along with other issues, one being the Westlawn redevelopment, where we were talking about $100 million in federal money that came into the city, and they couldn't meet the local hiring requirements for that under HUD Section 4, if I'm not mistaken. However, we had to challenge even our friends in that instance, because there were people who were telling us that no, everything's going fine, but we knew that it wasn't going fine. And ultimately, it turned out that we were right. And after just getting so frustrated at banging our heads against the wall, or even me just personally, I had options. We could keep doing that, or could run for office myself. If you're tired of elected officials, you can vote them out, or you can run. You can run for office yourself. And I encourage people to always consider not just voting, but consider public office as an option. And so that's why I decided to run for state rep. And now here as lieutenant governor, I'm proud to be able to travel to so many parts of Wisconsin. Our first year in office, we hit all 72 counties, was able to have some incredibly engaging conversations with so many people, communities across the state who had no idea about how things happen in Milwaukee. They only know what they've been told by politicians who want to exacerbate this urban-rural divide, or from from some ultra conservative or really radical media outlets also that paint this picture of Milwaukee that's just not fair. And so being able to have conversations with those people is, even during the campaign, is something that I hope help to build bridges, because we need those bridges across Wisconsin. We need to do that work to repair our communities. And some of those trips, unfortunately, were storm damage tours. And this is why I try to tell people everywhere I go, it's like, climate change isn't a partisan issue. The tornadoes don't stop at a person's doorstep to ask if they're a Democrat or a Republican before ravaging these folks' homes. And that was our approach also. When we were driving down the road and we saw somebody, we didn't stop and say, hey, are you a Democrat or a Republican, before we offered help to these individuals. And there were so many people who, had lost it all. And people with tears in their eyes, wondering if they, one, could afford to rebuild, two, want to know if it even made sense to rebuild, because we are seeing these 100-year storms occur much more frequently, almost every year, if not almost every other year, if not every year. And that is why this work is so important, because it also impacts lower income communities. It impacts communities of color. And we're talking about the communities who have had the least to do with climate change. And so understanding the equity side also, we know that we have tremendous issues in Wisconsin. It's not a secret. Wisconsin is constantly ranked first at being the worst at all things racial. And that can be incomes, that can be home ownership, that can be incarceration, that could be health outcomes. And that's why we have to be intentional we have to first talk about these issues. And unfortunately, we had an administration that wouldn't even give these things the time of day. They wouldn't discuss these issues because it wasn't high. It wasn't on their radar. It wasn't high on their priorities list because they didn't care to solve them. And in caring to solve these issues, it is a difficult task, but we have to do it. This is for the future. And honestly, combating racial injustice is an issue of sustainability. And our state budget proposal last year, we targeted the Black infant and maternal mortality rate in our state. We had historic increases for public education, including reworking the formula so that it could be more equitable. There was even, we even tried to get into the budget poverty aid for school districts with higher rates of poverty. And unfortunately, we had a legislature that blocked many of these proposals, Medicaid expansion being chief among them. One of the biggest issues of equity that we have right now is in healthcare. And our Republican-controlled legislature decided that this was just not important to them. And so the governor, in many ways, is just doing what he can. And he signed an executive order on equity and inclusion, which requires our state agencies to implement equity inclusion action plans and to do mandatory equity and inclusion trainings for state agencies and employees, my office included. And in moving to the next budget, we also instructed all of our state agencies to incorporate equity and sustainability into their budget requests, despite the revenue shortfalls that are projected. And these are just a couple of the ways that we've worked to advance equity in the administration. By no means will these solve all the problems, but they are steps in the right direction, steps that should have been taken 20 years ago so that we wouldn't be in this place right now. And we also are dealing with the apparent issues, the in-your-face issues of Black life. And I say issues of Black life because, one, policing is absolutely an issue, but two, issues like healthcare impact Black life, issues of the environment impact Black life. But we know that we have to prioritize equity when it comes to public safety. And this is an area that perhaps needs some of the most systemic change, because we're talking about life or death interactions that should not be that extreme. And back in May, the world saw the George Floyd incident, and that served as a wake-up call for a whole lot of people in so many communities. And people who have who are familiar with this story. It is just like a never-ending episode. Or, if you haven't experienced personally, chances are you've had a friend that's experienced this personally. And when we talk about criminal justice reform, it's not always just prisons and incarceration rates. Criminal justice reform also includes policing, because before a person ends up in an institution, they have an interaction with a police officer, and that is going to determine their fate. Either they're going to go home, they're going to end up in jail, or unfortunately, worse, end up dead. And so seeing this wake-up call for so many people, our state was then thrust into the spotlight with the shooting of Jacob Blake. And thankfully, he is alive, but this still falls into a very disturbing pattern. And it is very difficult for me to process how any person in the wake of even George Floyd's killing and the uprising, the people who stood up to demand justice in all parts of the state and all parts of this country, how an officer could still see fit to shoot someone in the back 7 times, and an unarmed person in the back, no less. And that just shows that systemic reforms are the bare minimum that we need right now. And what we need more than anything is resources to our communities. And it pains me to look at city budgets and see the allocations to city services, whether it's libraries, neighborhood services, and youth programs, and the larger chunk that goes to policing. And, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand that, if we were to resource communities properly, efficiently, and effectively, there will be much less of a need for policing in communities. When students, when children, young folks have stuff to do, when adults have jobs, and when they're employed, able to provide in an uncertain economy, no less, there is less of a need for law enforcement to be present in those communities. And so in Milwaukee, one of the most disturbing things too is how many officers don't live in the city. I think it's egregious that people will police a community and they don't even have to live under the same laws as that community. Law enforcement should not be hierarchical. If you think you're, too good or too cool to live in the same city that you police, you probably shouldn't be in policing, because you're going to look at people much differently when they're not your neighbors. You're going to look at people much differently when you are an outsider coming in as an occupying force. And that's exactly what's happening. And much of policing is governed at the municipal level, but our administration is working to make changes where we can. We introduced an accountability and transparency package after George Floyd was killed, before Jacob Blake. And after Jacob Blake, the governor called for a special session, and the legislature refused to convene. Instead, they wanted to come up with a task force. Now, as a chair of a task force, I understand why task forces are important. However, the recommendations are there because this isn't something that's new. This doesn't require some sort of bipartisan compromise. This is an issue of life and death. And if they had issues with the legislation that we proposed, then they should have debated it. They should have brought it to the floor of the state assembly or the floor of the state senate to be discussed in front of the public. And that's why I get so frustrated with the legislature, because gerrymandering has allowed them to play so many different types of games, whether it's with police accountability, whether it's with healthcare, whether it's the climate change or the pandemic. And we have legislators who would rather spend their time fighting us than fighting COVID-19. That is a disturbing pattern of inaction. This is the most inactive full-time legislature in the country right now. And I guess I'm going to get ready to close and just finishing up about our equity and our climate work, because again, racial equity doesn't just stop at criminal justice reform and policing. We need it in every policy area. We need it in labor and workforce issues. We need it, again, in healthcare. We need it, especially in the climate work. And for far too long, people in power have enacted policies that have resulted in environmental racism. This can be issues of where highways are constructed, where industries are located that poison air and poison water, policies that put indigenous people on the reservations, which literally cut them off from the resource that they need to thrive, or redlining, which did the same thing in communities, which put people in sort of a glass cage within their own communities, within their own cities. And we can't continue to allow communities that have already been harmed to suffer the consequences of a climate crisis. Again, like I said, despite having contributed the least to it. And that's why we've been intentional about centering environmental justice in the work of our task force. We made sure that we had a diverse membership in this task force. We were intentional about our presenters, and we worked to engage all the members, even our rural members, our corporate members, we've been intentional about involving them in discussions about systemic racism and environmental justice, because these are the folks that don't get it all the time. And we don't enter those conversations being all preachy. We enter those conversations wanting to involve them and hear their perspective and get their input and provide lessons where we need to. We have to center the voice of the most marginalized communities. I'm incredibly proud of the work that we've done on the task force, but I know that it's just one task force and it will not solve all the problems, but I sincerely hope that it will put us on the path towards a more equitable and sustainable future in this state, so that Wisconsin can not just be a national leader, but Wisconsin can be a global leader like we should be. But like I said, despite having so far to go, we are making significant strides in changing the dynamics. Our administration has the most diverse cabinet secretaries in our state's history, some of the most diverse appointments in our state's history, whether it's superintendent of public instruction, the superintendent of the state patrol, or emergency management director, appointments to boards, commissions, and most importantly, the judiciary. But we know that it can't stop there. We have to fundamentally change these systems so that everybody has an opportunity to thrive, so that people of color in our society can thrive as their neighbors do. And children of color can have exactly what they need to achieve their fullest potential as their neighbors do. And we can't do this alone. We're going to need everybody, including especially our faith communities, to take an active role in this work. I have no doubts that you all are doing it, but there are still areas where we know that each of us can step up and do something different or do something more. Our democracy only works when people make it work. And those who oppose change, they're making their voices heard loud and clear. The people who want things to stay the same or get worse or take us back a couple centuries, they are very loud about it. And we don't have to be as loud about it, but we can be smart about it. And I think we are being smart about it, but we have to up our intensity to make sure that we are bringing as many people into this movement as possible. So I'm asking for folks to stand up for policies that advance equity, to make sure that people have a seat at the table, to make sure that people aren't just having decisions made for them, oftentimes by people with nefarious intent, with no concern for those communities that they're making the decisions for. And we're at a turning point right now in the United States of America, where we can craft a society that works for everybody, where decisions are not being made at the expense of our most vulnerable, but we can only do that when everybody pitches in. So I know I went a little bit over my time. I just had a few things that I felt I just wanted to share with you all. And I feel like I'm here in person. And when I'm with you all in person, I have a good time. And when I have a good time, sometimes I get a little chatty. So thank you all so much for having me today.
Okay, at this time, I'm going to unmute everybody and people can raise their hand or ask questions.
Thank you very much, Mandela, for your comments and your good work. We've got Stacy Craig, who will fill us in more on the governor's task force, but let's take a few questions now. Mandela, your staff said you had about a half hour with us, so I won't cut you off. I'll let you decide when you need to go. In the meantime, raise your hand if you have a question. I see about a half of you, and I've got one question in the chat. If you don't have visual, go ahead and put a question in the chat. I'll ask the first question from the chat, and then I see Dan and BJ next. So Mary asks, I was hoping Governor Evers would show Wisconsin the leadership that Andrew Cuomo showed New York, coming on television, letting people know what was going on with COVID-19 data, letting people know what is being done to combat the virus, encouraging people what to do to be safe. Why didn't he?
Yeah, so the governor does, they were having COVID briefings with the Department of Health Services Secretary. In the beginning, they were doing it daily. It hasn't been daily these days, but that is feedback I can certainly take back to the governor's office. Be happy to.
Dan?
With the upcoming budget, it seems to me that some low-hanging fruit for reducing costs would be the Department of Corrections. What will it take to reduce the size of that monstrous budget? It's the second highest cost item in our budget. It's been there. It's been that way for a long time. What will it take to move that off the list?
Yeah, that is a good question, and obviously that was one of the pillars of my campaign, is reducing our state spending on corrections. And I wish it was a light switch. We're talking about 20 years of escalating costs, and so it would be very tough to like just slash that in half right away. But we are making strides. Like, there are fewer people who are behind bars right now than before. Now, it's not the chunk that I wish it could be, but the governor has got the pardons board active, and parole as well, and we hadn't had that for 8 years.
Right.
So it's a step-by-step process, man. Like, I wish we can accelerate this as much, if not more, than you. But that is an area that we are pushing. I am constantly pushing on the reduction of spending on corrections, because that is also just not sustainable, and it is a priorities mismatch when Department of Corrections spending is higher than UW spending, especially at a time where we can offer, where we should be working to offer more educational opportunities to children who wouldn't have, or students who would not have otherwise had them. So I'm 100% with you in figuring out where we can slash at the DLC budget.
Thank you.
BJ, and let's see, then Patricia's got a question, and Mike and Terry.
Thank you very much, Lieutenant Governor. I am wondering, besides voting and contacting our state legislators, how can we hold them accountable for and get them to actually work for their salary? It is abysmal what they have done this year, and we have no recourse, it seems.
Yeah, that's a good point. I always talk about, election days not being the end of an organizing cycle. Like, quite frankly, I think elections are the beginning, because you know who you have to apply that pressure to, you know who you need to hold accountable. And so it's important for us to make noise about that kind of stuff. Keep talking about it. That's the biggest thing. Like, and don't be afraid to send letters or emails or calls to your own, even if you have a friendly representative, somebody who is somebody who you feel is doing the right thing. Like, it's still important to contact those offices as well. Like, it's important to create those records so that people know that, yeah, we've got all these contacts about people asking us to do our jobs. And then, the basis of organizing is just getting, more people aligned on the same issue, and like having a congregation around you has an impact. And I think that there is strength, even if you were as First Unitarian, to step up and say, yeah, let's send something, like, as many of our members, sign on to this letter or do a form email. Like, those things, like, they have some weight. Like, I'm not going to say that on its own will work, but it's not just one thing that's going to work. It's a whole bunch of actions and activities in concert that are going to get it done. And I would also add public education, like, not as in schools, like educating the public, because a lot of people just don't know. I'm sure there are a lot of people, and I'm just going to guess, like, there are people in my circle who just don't get it, who don't know that information. So I feel that a way that we can be impactful is to reach out to our less engaged friends about it, or our friends who are going through an issue. We know people, all of us know people who've been impacted by COVID, either from a health perspective or from the economic perspective, people who are out of job, who are out of work. And I think that we should engage those people, at least in those conversations. And again, not a thing to be preachy, or not a thing where we're just giving some sort of lesson, but it helps if they know what is one of the main problems right now, what is something that's holding folks back from being able to recover from this.
Pat.
Thank you, Mandela Barnes. I've been a longtime fan, and I know my union, Local 212, was very helpful in helping get out the vote. My question is, how do you practice self-care on election day? And what do you recommend for our beloved community to help all the people who are going to be very stressed out?
For election day, and it hurts that, like, we can't be doing this kind of stuff in person. If you can, find a way to socialize safely, whether it's virtually or, just depending on how the weather is. Like, if you want to do something in, like, outside space or something, I think it helps to be around people. I cannot imagine what the 2016 election would have felt like if I was by myself. So being around people who share your values, who share your political beliefs on election day, is very helpful.
Volunteer to count the votes.
Yeah, there we go. That's another one. Yeah, be a part of seriously, that is a really good suggestion, Bruce. Like, be a part of the process. Seriously, like, because we need people who are going to step up to be on the front line of democracy, whether it's election observers, whether it's poll workers, or making sure that counts are accurate. And we need people to do that. And, that helps.
I will put a plug. I will put in a plug. I know our church is going to have people working with folks virtually the day after Election Day. So stay tuned. You'll see
Good.
information on how we move forward and how we take care of one another and how we hold one another's hand through this time.
Yeah. We've got people working with UU the Vote, Souls to the Polls, League of Conservation Voters, League of Women Voters, Supermarket Legends, Micah, Common Ground. There's no shortage of groups working on voting issues, and so you can get involved if you want. Mike, you're next.
Okay, Lieutenant Governor, you are, really impressive and really articulate and charismatic. And I'd be surprised if 10 years from now, you're not coming back as Senator or Governor Barnes. And we really appreciate your comment. My comment today follows, and this is just a suggestion. I watch the governor briefings pretty regularly on COVID. And I think the content is great and the people are great. I just would make a small comment as somebody who works in public relations a lot. I would recommend you get out of the State House in that museum piece conference room he does those briefings from. Get out to West Allis, get out to the testing sites, make it sexy, make it like Cuomo, Gavin Newsom, like CNN, Fox News, have graphics, use your IT department. I just think your message is great, but you could improve the graphics and the optics, and I think it would have impact. But I think, you're doing a great job. So thank you for coming today.
Dude, that is a really, really good suggestion. Stu, that is a really good suggestion. And I will add that to my conversation. Thank you for that.
Terry.
Yes, my question is, what is the status of I-94 proposed expansion? Expanding I-94 would both have very negative impacts on the climate and on the people in the surrounding neighborhoods.
So first, I gotta acknowledge how Bruce called on you as you are right next to him. I gotta get that laugh out before anything. Second of all, I'll say I've met a lot of people, some on this call, being against the I-94 expansion, and that's a conversation I think people should have. I think it's important, like I said, even when people we support are in office, it's important to make our voices heard about things like this. I can't say that that's I'm the biggest fan of expansion of the freeway. Obviously, I think our priority should be in mass transportation. I think our priority should be in like decreasing number of cars on the road. And I say that, as I think about my dad as a member of the United Auto Workers, and what that means. But I think that in order for us to build more sustainable communities, I think highways should need to sort of take a back seat. But that's why I think make your voices heard. And I think people have been making their voices heard. But it's important to provide that feedback to the governor's office and talk about more options that we should have made available to us. I am happy though that we are going to be working on the expansion to have Amtrak go to Minneapolis to make that trip a little more convenient. It's not the high-speed rail that we all hoped and dreamed for, or that we actually had in our hands and had it snatched away from us, but it is one small step.
Okay, Jerry Frederickson asks, let's make this the last question, then we'll let you go.
Okay.
He says the Walker administration let many scientists go in the DNR and even kept info about climate change off the DNR website. How has this changed under the Evers administration?
Happy to close out on a softball. That was one of the first things that we did. Was restore climate change section to the website and making sure that we are letting science guide the way. On election night, when I found out that we won, when I took the stage, first words I said is we're bringing science back. And I am proud that we are an administration that is doing that, taking it very, very seriously, understanding the very real threat that it poses to people's lives and livelihoods all across the state. And like I said, also just provides us an opportunity to be a leader in something. It also provides us an opportunity to create jobs, just areas that we've been missing out on. And, you know, you can't take anybody seriously if they, at this point in time, won't discuss climate change or won't acknowledge that it is a very real thing. So I am proud of the steps that we're taking, and I anticipate there'll be many more steps.
Well, thank you very much. Let's all give Mandela Barnes a hand, either virtually or clap, however. Thank you very much. We wish you well, and we'll be glad to see you back in Milwaukee.
Yeah, thank you. Look forward to seeing you all.
Good. Bye.
Goodbye.
Okay. Bruce, I'd like to announce the forum for next week. The J. Lee Fruit Company, based here in Milwaukee, helps people all around the world sell dried fruit at living wages. So that will be the topic for next week at the normal time.
Good. Thank you. So to finish off the forum here, we have Stacy, member of the Governor's Task Force on Climate Change, and can fill us in there. For us, the very interesting thing is I discovered that she is also a UU minister. She is at the Chequamegon. Did I pronounce that right?
Nope.
No, how do you pronounce it?
Chequamegon.
Chequamegon. Congregation up in Ashland, right?
Yep.
Up north, good. And so we might, after she makes some comments about the governor's task force, we can find out more about what's going north and her path to UU ministership. And remind you all that we have a chance to attend Kimberly's ordination this afternoon. That is going to be online, and we can have a virtual parade at church this afternoon. So we hope to see you all there this afternoon. But welcome, Stacy. Thanks for coming on for the balance of the hour. And please tell us a little about your experience on the governor's task force and how the recommendations are shaking.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's really great to meet you all and to extend my kind of UU family here. So I was part of so there was 3 subcommittees within the task force, and I was part of the land use and conservation subcommittee. I was a board member with Wisconsin Conservation Voters for about 9 years. And that was a lot of my introduction into how do we take critical environmental issues such as climate change and translate those into state policy and legislation. So it was really an honor to serve on this task force. And we have now concluded 27 meetings, including 5 public listening sessions. We broke records in terms of how many people participated in the public listening sessions. And I just want to give you a quick overview of the guiding principles that we use to do this work. And that included, number 1, this was developed by Lieutenant Governor Barnes's office. He chaired the committee. It was really an honor to work with him. And as you can guess, that meant that there was a strong emphasis on several different areas, not just environmental impacts, but we had a whole framework around environmental justice. So recognizing that the healthy environment is something that we should all have access to, and that is not the case right now. So all of the work that we did took into consideration an environmental justice framework. In addition, we were encouraged to think about a diversity of implementation, not just executive orders, not just things we could put in the budget, but things that would be forwarded to the state legislature, that could be done through regulation, that might be able to be done at the grassroots level. So all those were on the table, thinking about a diverse implementation of the recommendations that came forward. We were asked to factor in public participation and public comments into the decision-making framework of what we submitted to the governor's office. And so there were several of us who went through public comments and said, you know, this one really needs its own memo because it came up so frequently and so consistently from public comments. So public participation was not just something we did to check off a box. It was something that we took very seriously. And then the overall guiding principle to this was that we needed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That's key. And the guiding principle stated that we wanted to reduce those in increments by 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. And have all electricity consumed in Wisconsin carbon-free by 2050. So that was the bigger picture framework that we operated in. And through these 27 meetings, 5 listening sessions, countless presentations, and a lot of this is online, you'll see that we have now 48 recommendations that are going forward, that the entire group is signing off on, that will be delivered on time by October 31st to Governor Evers' office. 48 recommendations. That's called the Tier 1 recommendations that are going forward. And that document will also be released to the public. It won't be able to be out by October 31st. It should be out by November 15th. So that's something that you can reference to get all the details of these 48 recommendations. In addition, there was 8 recommendations that came forward from the task force that didn't receive broad support from the coalition, from the task force members. As Lieutenant Governor Barnes mentioned, we had stakeholders from all different sectors. And so there was 8 recommendations that ended up in what's called the Tier 2. The Tier 2 is not something that's going to be deleted. It's something that is going to be continued to be taken into consideration. Several task force members have committed to continuing to work on those Tier 2 recommendations, but they aren't part of the package that's going to go to Governor Evers as the official recommendations from this task force. Just a few highlights. There are 48 recommendations, and within each recommendation, there are pages of details. And so I can't go into all of them with you today, but I can tell you that they're broken up into several areas. And I hope you'll join me in just the extreme excitement and joy that comes from seeing so many aspects considered and going forward. Food systems, agriculture, forestry, transportation, education, resilient systems, energy, clean economy, and climate justice. Each one of those subcategories then has additional memos or topics that are broken up that go forward. Just a very, very quick, a few highlights, and then I can open it up for questions. So one of the highlights that I'm passionate and excited about is the establishment of a Wild Rice Council. This is modeled after Minnesota. So wild rice is a staple food of the Ojibwe people who, there's 3 reservations right around where I live, and subsistence living is critical for their culture, for their being, and wild rice is incredibly sensitive to climate change and water fluctuations. So just as an example, it's a very specific topic, but that's an example of one of the memos that's moving forward. There was a carbon reduction goal that was put forward for the power sector. So by 2030, we would reduce the power sector's net carbon by 60%. And by 2050, reduce it by 100%. commentary from the energy industry mentioned that they know like how to get to a reduction of 60% by 2030, that the technology is in place to do that, and that they feel comfortable that they can reach that goal. I mean, we're 10 years out from reducing, carbon by 60% from the power sector. However, the technology doesn't actually exist yet to reach that 100% goal by 2050. And so it's understood that part of what we may have to be doing is leaning into technology development, looking at new opportunities for these things. And what we heard again and again is that the electrical and energy sector has a focus on safety, reliability, and affordability. And customers want to go further and faster with renewables than a lot of the current standards are at. And so there's a lot of public support. There's a lot of grassroots organizing around that work. And so there's a lot of encouraging context that I believe shows that we can meet those goals that we've set forward. And I just want to mention that those, I believe, are nationally, those are the most aggressive goals of any state. Please don't quote me on that completely. That's my understanding of it. And I've double checked. Other states have similar goals, but not with the same timelines and not with the same amounts. So it's pretty exciting. Wisconsin is definitely looking at setting goals. And I just want to mention with that one that we heard from the public, we heard from the task force members that reducing carbon by 2050 by 100%, we needed to do that yesterday in terms of looking at the carbon emissions and the impacts of climate change. And so there's also a kind of despair and despondency that we heard from the public and from our members that are saying, the catastrophic impacts of climate change are showing up in 2050 based on what we can do right now to decrease carbon emitted into the atmosphere. And so while these goals are very aggressive, and while I'm really proud of the work the task force did, I also want to just recognize that there's a lot of work to be done, and there's still pressure to do it faster and go further, especially by the younger generation. The public comments from young parents, the younger generation definitely had that sense of urgency that we heard very clearly. And I think that the 48 total package of recommendations really encapsulate that urgency that is happening throughout all of these different sectors. There's there's support within the memos going forward for local food systems, buying local, buying Wisconsin, farm to fork proposals. There's support for watershed work, farmer-led watershed groups, flood resilience for rural and urban watersheds. Up here in northern Wisconsin, you may know that we've had 2 500-year storm events, one in 2012 and one in 2016, and one 1,000-year storm event in 2018. It is just changing the landscape around us. It is more water than our lands can hold. And just this year, we had 7 million gallons of sewage flow into Lake Superior just from Ashland alone because of outdated stormwater systems that cannot handle the amount of runoff that we have right now. So these places throughout the state, the La Crosse region, and all of the farmland, and they are having similar high water levels. Madison, extreme rain events. Kirsten Shed from Milwaukee and August Ball from Milwaukee were great contributors to my subcommittee, who talked a lot about working with both urban and rural infrastructure, and that is reflected in several of the proposals going forward. And one of the things that I'm really excited about was a proposal that talks about resilience planning. So we saw again and again that changing the way that we are doing infrastructure and planning for our communities can have a huge savings when big rain events and other climate-induced catastrophic events happen. And with resilience planning, we can do climate risk assessments, we can be building into adaptive capacities, and that saves a lot of money on the back end of cleanups and planning for these things. So those are just a few of the highlights that I thought I'd share with you. And Bruce, I guess I'll just pause there and see if there's anything you were hoping that I'd touch on, or if there's questions.
Yeah, let's just see if there's any questions that people have. There's 21 of us on the call now. So those of you who have your video, you can raise your hand or else put something in the chat. Pat, I just put a question into the chat for you, if you can take a look at it for private communication. But any questions, thoughts, concerns about the governor's task force?
I have a question.
Mark and then BJ.
Okay. Some states have third-party situations where companies can install solar on people's homes. Wisconsin does not have that. Do you see that happening anytime soon?
Yeah, Mark, thanks for bringing that up. That did come up. It was something that came up in public comments as well as through conversations with presenters. That memo did go forward, but it ended up in the tier 2 category. So it will not be part of the package that is forwarded to the governor's office. And I'm not entirely sure, where it fell short in the process. But right now, that third-party funding for solar is not one that's officially being recommended from the task force, but it was put together. It still is in all of the documents of the task force. And as I mentioned, there's several people who have committed to continuing to work on those tier 2 proposals.
Yeah, my guess is it was utility companies' opposition that wouldn't allow that to go ahead. BJ.
Yes, thank you for the incredible work you're doing and how well you condense so much information so well for us. When the points, the recommendations are made, I know that we will have support from the governor and lieutenant governor and the public, but I am a tad concerned about our legislators. And I wonder if you will have plans to put together maybe a list of talking points for people to people, as the lieutenant governor mentioned when I asked about getting the legislators to work, and he said talk to each other. And I realized, you know what, especially for something like this, you did such an excellent job of giving us some key points. The easier you make it, the better we can support you. And then probably a separate talking points of what we can send to our legislators, so that we can get on track and we can start building up a library of all the support that the recommendations have. Or if you have any other ideas of how we can get through to those kids.
Absolutely. And I think, that guiding principle that talked about a diversity of implementation strategies also was just in response to the reality of where Wisconsin is, with a divided, senator or Senate and governor's office, and needing multiple strategies to implement things, because some can be implemented more easily, but then they could be repealed with a different governor, for example. But you're absolutely right. The best way for this to go forward is to have broad public support. And that's my understanding, is that this document that's going to come out in mid-November is going to be, have a beautiful cover, be very easily digestible, and is caring about the language that's used so that it isn't the kind of language about climate change that makes us shut down, right? So, and I recognize that I even used some of that today, and I apologize for that. A lot of times when we talk about climate change, my care and my urgency can talk about it as, you know, I use words like catastrophic, and you know, in order for us to stay engaged in this, we need to recognize that urgency and not feel paralyzed in the work. And so there's a lot of care going into the way that it's communicated, so that it infuses that energy that we can act, we can make a difference, and diffuses that paralysis that can come with this topic. I will mention to a couple of folks who I'm in touch with this idea of really having people-to-people talking points and you know, legislative talking points. I'm wondering if either Clean Wisconsin or Wisconsin Conservation Voters could take a lead on that. They both had representation on the task force and saw the whole process, and their real strength is in, you know, connecting with thousands and thousands of voters across Wisconsin. Just thinking about how can maybe we as members of the task force, you know, share things like I am today. So thank you for that.
There is a new organization that is birthing called the Wisconsin UU State Action Network. So there are UUs across the state that are starting to band together, and perhaps the kind of conversations that Stacy's talking about could be part of that effort. Stacy, I don't see any more questions. Maybe to finish us out this morning, you could say a word about what's happening with your fellowship up there. Tell me again how you pronounce the fellowship.
Yeah, Shawamigan.
Shawamigan. So a little bit about what's happening with your fellowship up there and your path to ministry. Yeah,
thanks so much. So I started as the minister of the Shawamigan Unitarian Universalist Fellowship in January. And I actually did a director of religious education with them a few years ago as part of my discernment process of going back to seminary. And so I just graduated this year with a Master's of Divinity. And I really decided to go into ministry after working for several years in outdoor education, environmental education, and experiential education. That I was really interested in kind of devoting my life to more of a climate change focus, and doing that through building resilient communities and communities that were fed. And I was really thinking of it from a spiritual standpoint, that communities that are fed through connection in a time of possible despair, and in a time where there's a lot of changing and transforming systems. And how do we continue to stay rooted in who we are and in our values? So that's really the work I felt called to do, was thinking about transforming communities and times and all of the threats of climate change. And really one of the responses is being a strong, resilient community with deep spiritual roots. Little did I know that I'd be called to kind of do that work in my first year here with the pandemic, and needing to really, work in adaptive ministry and resilience and different ways of connecting. That's why I went into ministry, and it was a great first step into ministry was to say, this is really what the work looks like. If you're serious about this, put on your stretch out a little bit and put on your adaptive clothes here, because this is where we're going. And that's been my path into ministry. I consider myself a climate change chaplain. That's a kind of a volunteer capacity that I just try to show up for youth and youth activism, to hear their anger, concern, questions, their love, their hopes for the future, their hopes for having children, and just stand with them in kind of a chaplain role. I also, as I mentioned, I have a background in environmental education, outdoor education, and worked with the Wisconsin League of Conservation Voters for about 9 years as a board member. And so come to this work with environmental justice as my passion. it's a great fit for the Schwamigan Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, as they are a very outdoor, kind of environmental, social justice oriented fellowship. They have about 100 people that were meeting in person before the pandemic. We worship every other Sunday, and they have a huge focus on music. And we're continuing those focus areas, and we are now online on Zoom. So if you ever would like to join us, you're welcome to, although it'd probably be in at the same time as you all gather here. Our UU fellowship, one of the reasons why we've been growing and able to sustain is that we've had a strong RE program. And a partnership with Northland College. We meet on campus of Northland College, and many of the people who attend are students, recent alumni, or people who have attended while students and then made their home in this region, as well as faculty and staff that work at the college. And so we're a really diverse and fun group, artistic, and very close to the land. And it's really a joy and an honor to serve this fellowship and to get to do something I love and make a living off of it. So in addition to, I mentioned that we're just I'm a third-time minister with them. And so I'm also an adjunct professor at Northland College in their religious studies program, and a volunteer EMT with Mason Ambulance. And that is another role that really has huge climate impacts that you wouldn't even believe. It's just amazing what our first responders are going through in these climate events.
Wow. Well, glad to hear about your call, Stacy. I think we need some more climate change chaplains. You're the first one I've heard use that term per se, but Jennifer Nordstrom, our senior minister, I called to ministry for a lot of the same concerns. So I hope you and she can connect in your professional capacities. And we look forward to meeting you. General Assembly, if it's in person, is supposed to be in Milwaukee next summer. So we hope to see you there. And we're glad to have you here in Wisconsin.
Whether
Any
online
other-
or in person, I'll plan to see you at the General Assembly. I'm really excited. And if we can, we'll try to bring a youth delegation down.
Wonderful, wonderful. Suggest that you and your congregation connect with UU Ministry for Earth. If you haven't yet already, there's wonderful connect. And any other comments, questions, or thoughts before we close out our forum this morning? Patricia.
I just want to say, Stacy, we end up going places, and sometimes you find one other brave person and you end up talking to them about their courageous act. And lo and behold, I'll eventually work in that I'm a Unitarian Universalist and go, oh, I am too. So the fact that Bruce was surprised to learn that you're a UU environmental justice or climate chaplain is just something that made my day.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all. We'll close out now. Thank you for participating. Hope to see many of you this afternoon at Kimberly's ordination, or next week. I think the forum will be very interesting too, with also environmental and social justice implications. So thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.